Marion Montgomery, 1925 to 2011, was a novelist and poet, but is remembered mainly for his literary and cultural criticism. An Anglican, he shared the same background and outlook as his Catholic friend, peer, and fellow Georgian, the writer Flannery O'Connor, so much so that he too described himself as a hillbilly Thomist. His cultural criticism draws on Thomism and Southern Agrarianism, and stresses the importance of metaphysical realism, localism, and tradition. His literary criticism includes perceptive studies on writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, T.S. Eliot, Flannery O'Connor, and Walker Percy. In this interview, Professor Michael M. Jordan discusses Montgomery's work and some of his best books. Michael M. Jordan is Professor Emeritus of English at Hillsdale College and earned his PhD in English under the direction of Marion Montgomery at the University of Georgia. He lectured on the work of various Southern authors, the Southern Agrarians, Donald Davidson, Robert Penn Warren, Flannery O'Connor, Amy Bradford, Richard Weaver, and Walker Percy. He's also written essays and reviews for various journals of scholarship and opinion, including Chronicles, Touchstone, The Southern Partisan, Modern Age, the Intercollegiate Review, the South Carolina Review, the Southern Humanities Review, Chattahoochee Review, the University Bookman. And in 2005, he selected and edited a collection of Montgomery's essays on matters Southern, essays about literature and culture in 1964 to 2000. Professor Jordan, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and honored to talk about Marion Montgomery's work.
We opened with a brief biographical sketch of Montgomery. What would you add to it?
It is clear that Marion Montgomery's work is inspired by Thomism and by agrarianism. I think we could add to that it is also inspired by what he called the vision and the insights of the prophetic poet. Marion said that the prophetic poet, and he was a poet and a novelist, but he said that the prophetic poet is calling us back to known but forgotten truths, things that we once knew but now we have forgotten. And the reason we have forgotten is because since the Renaissance and the gradually development of modernism, there has been a shrinking of the mind's access to reality. We've been cut off from tradition and from transcendence. And so we've forgotten things that we used to know. And as a poet and a novelist, he adds to the Thomism, the principles of Thomistic thought, and the Southern agrarian attention to the local scene, the insights of the poet, the gift of analogy and imagination and intuition, and then the fiction writer's careful attention to detail. And so I think that might be something that would add to his address to his readers through his books. Thomism, the thought of the Southern agrarians, but also this calling as a prophetic poet.
And what's your fondest recollection of Marion Montgomery?
My fondest recollection would be the many times I spent visiting with him at his home in Crawford. He taught at the University of Georgia, but lived 17 miles distant in a small village. And Marion and his wife, Dorothy Montgomery, or Dot, were very generous and hospitable. And so they invited their students, their friends, to come for visits, for hospitality, and spent many times as a student, later as a married man with children, visiting with the Montgomerys. And so it was his personal generosity and hospitality. It's something that you may not pick up from reading his books, but when he died, there was a tribute to him paid in the the Christendom Review, remembering Marion Montgomery. And again and again and again, the people who do remember Marion and Dot say how generous and hospitable they were. So I think that personal feature is really important. And a friend and colleague of mine said visiting with the Montgomerys was something like perfection, and it really was. So what he does in his books is wonderful and great, but then what he and Mary and Dot did personally is also quite remarkable.
Montgomery was a novelist and a poet. How do his works compare to other notable Southern authors of the period, such as Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, and Wendell Berry?
Marion's, well, let me start with this. Flannery O'Connor once said, when asked about her work in connection with the work of William Faulkner, the greatest Southern writer in the 20th century, Flannery O'Connor said, "No one wants his mule stranded on the track when the Dixie Limited comes roaring down." And this was her way of saying, I really don't want to put my work into connection with that of the great William Faulkner. Well, having said that, Marion's first novel, The Wandering of Desire, is very Faulknerian in its theme and style and in its address to the reader. And so there is a Faulknerian dimension. He knew Faulkner, and there you can see some similarities in The Wandering of Desire, his first novel. I think Marion's second novel, Darrell, published in 1964, shows some evidence of his familiarity with the work of Flannery O'Connor. There is some whimsy, some a little of the grotesque, not as much as the violence, the disturbing violence that you have in her work. But I think that there is an influence from Flannery O'Connor. His third novel, Fugitive, published in 1974, is a fascinating, maybe an experimental novel that I think probably shows the influence of, it clearly shows the influence of his familiarity with the fugitive poets, the Southern agrarians, but it's conveyed through fascinating stories and vignettes rendered in the local idiom, that just wonderful stories. But as far as a particular single author, the only one that maybe comes to mind is if you've read Wendell Berry's work, you get saturated into a local community over time. Fugitive shows some of that, so maybe a little bit of Wendell Berry in his, Port William, the saturation of life and people over time, families over time. You get some of that flavor in the novel Fugitive.
And do any of his novels, poems, or short stories distill the central themes of his cultural criticism?
They do. It doesn't come up in the same way, but they are addressing the various concerns that he has with the family and the assaults on the family, the challenge of living in a world that has separated itself from tradition and from transcendence. I think all three of the novels do deal with Old South and New South changes over time, and of course that is his cultural criticism is really focused on that, the changes that have occurred since the Renaissance and the Reformation that have caused our world to shrink and our awareness of reality to be truncated because of materialism, secularism. So yes, it is the case. I should point out that it's interesting that Marion wrote his novels and most of his poetry in the 60s and in the early 70s. And then he began increasingly to do the cultural criticism and wrote over time 22 separate works. And so apparently he decided or discerned that his calling was to do the cultural criticism. Though I do, as I mentioned initially, his gifts as poet and as fiction writer make that cultural criticism all the more vivid and vital because of his attention to the local, the particular, the concrete, the way a poet or a novelist is. And so it's not philosophical abstractions and definitions, but it gets into the fabric and the texture, the warp and the woof of the world on the ground. That's a real virtue.
You've already mentioned how Montgomery can be classified as a Southern agrarian. For those who are not familiar with this movement, could you describe what makes one a Southern agrarian?
Okay. When Marion Montgomery talks about the South and the world that has been described and treated with in the Southern Agrarians in their manifesto, "I'll Take My Stand." I don't know how many of our auditors are familiar with "I'll Take My Stand," an anthology published in the 1930 by 12 Southerners, most of them from Vanderbilt University, who were taking their stand for the South and the agrarian tradition against industrialism, urbanism, secularism, and a host of isms that seem to come with the industrialism. But when he speaks of that South, it's not just the South. It's the older way of living before modernity and changes. And of course, the big features of modernity would be industrialization, urbanization, specialization, and commercialism, and a host of things that really do separate us from the ground of our local realities. He quotes frequently in his work, Marion Montgomery quotes Stark Young. Stark Young was one of the Southern agrarians and wrote in the Agrarian Manifesto this. He said, "We defend certain qualities in the South, not because the South belongs to them, but because, not because they belong to the South, but because the South belongs to them." And so what he's saying is really what had been manifested or incarnated in the South, the American South, was really certain values of I think you could say of Christendom or of Western civilization, recognition of the importance of one's time and place, recognition of the importance of tradition, recognition of the crucial significance of ceremony and hierarchy. And so this is to say that the Southern agrarians certainly influenced him, but I think Montgomery would say, well, I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn is an honorary Southerner. I think Dostoevsky is a Southerner. He might even say St. Thomas was a Southerner, but it is really to bring the Southern into this larger camp of, I think you could say, Christendom, those old truths that are now, of course, increasingly diminished and challenged. And that's why the agrarians. I'm not sure whether that gets to an answer to your question or not.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Why is it worth reading Montgomery for Catholics in particular?
I think he was a Anglo-Catholic himself, not a Roman Catholic. But the chief guide in his thinking is St. Thomas Aquinas, and he is frequently citing St. Thomas Aquinas's basic principles and attitudes and vision in his work. In addition to that, Marion draws readily upon the work of the Neo-Thomists. He read Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, Joseph Pieper, and others, and he's really familiar with them and their insights. They knew more than he did, than some of the Neo-Thomists. And so this absorption of Thomism and the thought of the Neo-Thomists in connection with art, politics, economics, it just makes him more and more essentially Catholic in his vision. And he does emphasize the universality of the Catholic tradition. I think Marion would have said that the Catholic, or the knowing the world through the eyes of a St. Thomas and from the Neo-Thomists, it's introducing us to minds greater than our own. And so again, I think that's he's describing a world that was not undone by Renaissance and Reformation and Enlightenment and other things, and he's calling us back to that older world with St. Thomas as his chief guide. So he's very Catholic. I think Marion, more than anybody I knew, always brought everything, economics, literature, philosophy, popular culture, science, education, into contact with the cause of causes, to the creator of being. It's just, and I think that was Thomas, St. Thomas's. Everything is filtered through a basic address to the creator and our creatureless status.
Yes. I mean, as he says when he's in the first question of the Summa Theologiae, when he's saying, what sense does theology encompass all else? His point is that theology can consider God in himself or anything else insofar as it relates to God, the principle and end of all things.
Exactly. You said it in one sentence what I was trying to say.
My excuse is that I do a lot of specialization in St. Thomas, so that's my excuse. In Montgomery's works are packed full with references to philosophers and writers. Is it fair to say that unless you're well read, you might struggle to follow his works of cultural criticism? If so, are any of his works more accessible to less advanced readers?
Yes, I do believe it's clear Marion Montgomery's work is difficult because of its wide-ranging and philosophical address to all sorts of things. He knew a great deal, far more than many of us. And some of his longer works are quite lengthy as well as difficult. And by the way, I'm not the first to call attention to the difficulty of his work. Others have as well. His trilogy, The Prophetic Poet and the Spirit of the Age, in 3 volumes, is about 1,500 pages in length, and that's long, and it is difficult. There is a much easier access to his work, and it's the work that I actually edited, his On Matters Southern. It's a collection of his essays on matters Southern that is shorter, and it has the virtue of having the Thomistic overview as background, but it is much more accessible to readers. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that I was happy to publish those 16 essays in On Matters Southern, because it was an introduction to his work that would be easier for readers than the much more formidable, longer, and more philosophical studies.
So, On Matters Southern is a good entry point into his work. Which essays from the anthology merit particular note?
If you wanted to get Marion's take on the Southern Agrarians, I would recommend his long and devastating review, Bells for John Stewart's Burden. And so this would be showing Marion's knowledge of the Southern Agrarians and his defense of them in a review of a book that was rather shallow and prejudicial, not in the best sense, but dismissive of the Southern Agrarians. And so he comes to their defense. And so that would be a good work to know about Montgomery's familiarity with those fugitive poets and those Southern Agrarians, and actually the new critics, because the principal figures of the Southern Agrarians, John Crow Ransom, Allen Tate, Robert Penn Warren, Andrew Lytle, Donald Davidson, they were part of three literary movements: fugitive poets, Southern Agrarians, and then new critics. So that is one of the works that I would certainly, or one of the essays, excuse me, it's a book review that I would recommend. I'm really partial to the Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal. Late in Marion's life, he took an increasing interest in the work of Walker Percy. He writes actually 2 books on Walker Percy. One of them is Eudora Welty and Walker Percy, the concept of home in their life and their literature, and the other was with Walker Percy at the Tupperware party. So, but you get a sort of introduction to those longer and more works in this short piece, Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal. Is this a time where we might elaborate a little bit on that particular essay, or do
yes,
we want to?
By all means.
Okay. In Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal, Marion focuses on Percy's first novel, The Moviegoer, but he opens this essay with both Percy's and O'Connor's comments on liberal sentimentality. If you know the Thanatos syndrome by Percy, you have Father Smith, who says in the course of the novel that liberal sentimentality leads to the gas chamber. Well, Flannery O'Connor had said the same thing. She said that in her memoir of Mary Ann. More famously, she said that when sentimentality is separated from the source of sentimentality, Christ, it leads to terror. Its logical outcome is the forced labor camps and the fumes of the gas chambers. And so you've got both Percy and O'Connor commenting on how liberalism and liberal sentimentality leads to the gas chambers. And what Marion does is that he begins there by saying that that's the Christian scandal, because the Christian scandal says the individual human person has value, and this liberal sentimentality will justify abortion, euthanasia. So that's where he begins. So here you have, to me, it seems, really powerful witnesses, Christian witnesses in both Percy and in Flannery O'Connor. But where this Marion's little piece, Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal, it actually focuses mostly on the moviegoer. Binks Bolin is the protagonist in the moviegoer, and he's on a search for identity. There's a comic moment at the opening of the novel where he mentions all his credit cards and his library cards with his name on them, And he rather sardonically realizes that's not really how you establish who you are. Buy a card with your name on it. But he is trying to find out who he is and how he fits into this world. He goes to the movies. He's a moviegoer. What Marion does, and it's fascinating in this little essay, is that he points out that Binks's attempt to certify himself and anchor himself in time and place and to discover his identity by going to the movies and by searching, it is really manifest how you do it, not through the movies, but through the Mass. It is the Mass that actually is the drama that certifies the self in time and place, the drama of the Mass. And to make this sense, to help it make sense, if I could, the idea here is that the Word made flesh certifies our time and our place in sanctifying us. I think the point is made clear in, if I might look at two brief passages, both of them from Percy, and these are things that Marion calls our attention to. And this is the passage, and when it's related briefly with a short paragraph in the Holiness of the Ordinary, you'll see how what Marion says about the Mass and Binks's discovery of and the Mass certifying, helping you to be not lost in the cosmos, but to find your place. And so here's the passage. His forehead is an ambiguous sienna color and pied. It is impossible to be sure that he received ashes. When he gets in his mercury, incidentally, Mercury is the messenger of the gods, and this is Percy's way of saying we're about to have a revelation, a message from God. And so when he gets in his mercury, he does not leave immediately, but sits looking down at something on the seat beside him. A sample case, an insurance manual. I watch him closely in the rearview mirror. It is impossible to say why he is here. Is it part and parcel of the complex business of coming up in the world? Or is it because he believes that God himself is present here at the corner of Elysian Fields and Bon Enfants? Or is he here for both reasons, through some dim, dazzling trick of grace, coming for the one and receiving the other as God's own importunate bonus? And so this is Binks thinking about how one can know God and be certified by God through the Word of God made flesh and dwelling among us and received in the Mass. And Binks in the novel doesn't. The next sentence is impossible to say, and so Binks is uncertain what to make of this. But this is a sign here in the novel that the way you stop being lost in the cosmos is through the drama of the Mass, receiving the Word made flesh that dwells among us. The other brief passage I'd like to read that Marion cites is a short paragraph from The Holiness of the Ordinary, which is a very late essay written by Walker Percy. And this is what Percy says. The passage I just read from The Moviegoer talks about the holiness in the ordinary, and this does as well. And this is what Percy writes. While no serious novelist knows for sure where his writing comes from, I have the strongest feeling that, whatever else the benefits of the Catholic faith, it is of a particular felicitous use to the novelist. Indeed, if one had to design a religion for novelists, I can think of no better. What distinguishes Judeo-Christianity in general from other world religions is its emphasis on the value of the individual person in view of man as a creature in trouble. Its view of man as a creature in trouble, working to get out of it and accordingly on the move. And to this anthropology, the special marks of the Catholic Church, the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, which whatever else they confer the highest significance upon the ordinary things of this world: bread, wine, water, touch, breath, words, talking, listening. And what do you have? You have a man in a predicament and on the move in a real world of real things, a world which is a sacrament and a mystery, a pilgrim whose life is a searching and a finding. And so what Montgomery does in Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal is weave together these the trajectory of the moviegoer as a novel and connecting it with what the drama of the Mass and what Binks has perhaps in his future. So I would recommend that particular essay as well. Bells for John Stewart's Burden for the agrarian side, and then for the Catholic, perhaps the Thomistic side, is Walker Percy and the Christian Scandal.
Another of the essays on matters Southern is entitled Books, 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 Difficult Choices in Time of Intellectual Stress. And in this essay, Montgomery recommends important books in the Western tradition and some that are pertinent for readers from the American South. I was surprised by how the bulk of the entries in the work's general category were by mid-20th century philosophers or intellectuals: T.S. Eliot, Etienne Gilson, Gabriel Marcel, Jacques Maritain, Joseph Pieper, Heinrich Roman, Leo Strauss, Eric Voegelin. Why do you value this essay?
I should point out that the context of this books was Marion Montgomery was asked to put together 2 lists of books that would help a young Southerner get oriented in his time and place in the 20th century, right close to the millennium, 20th century. And so what Montgomery does is he says, I assume that the reader would be familiar with the great tradition, with the Greco-Roman and the Judeo-Christian writings, with Homer, with Dante, with Augustine. So what Montgomery was, he wanted to provide books for orientation for someone who finds himself in the modern academy, an academy that is an intellectual desert. And so assuming that the student has read widely in the great tradition, he says, here are some particular books that will help you get oriented in our particular time of troubles. And so you have books for the Southerner, from Southern authors, and then that the long list that you mentioned, that's where he delves into the thought of some of the neo-Thomists, because they see so much more and will help the student get oriented in his time and his place. It's also interesting that all of these works, to me, it's interesting that this is not poetry and it's not fiction. This is critical studies that try to orient the person in a time of intellectual chaos.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.